outraged, and he wanted to have money. He wanted to have the Mexican government pay damages. And good luck is all I can say. If you know about the times, how many Americans were killed, and the American ambassador Wilson tried everything to get anybody to pay anything, no money. But Sommerfeld went to Madero and said, look, if you want the German government to recognize your government, pay. And so the German government is the only government in the whole Mexican Revolution that ever got paid for victims of violence in Mexico, okay? So Sommerfeld was very interested, and I found those letters going back and forth very interesting. So Paul von Hinze, when you read history books, it's always said the Germans didn't like Madero. It's not true at all. Hinze was very supportive of Madero, especially since Madero stood up for this Covadonga thing, and because of Sommerfeld being the liaison between the German government and the Madero government, Hinze actually went to the German emperor and said, you know what, they're okay, they're reformists, they're not, we are safe, our investments are safe as long as Madero keeps his government. He was democratically elected, the German government recognized him, so this was all good. I don't know where Katz and all these other guys are getting that the Germans didn't like Madero. It's just not true. So then we have Sherborne G. Hopkins. Anybody ever heard of him? Yes. Sherborne Hopkins. Hopkins was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., a lawyer, and he had for years financed revolts in Central America. And his main clients, because he was a lawyer, his main clients were Charles Randolph Flint. Anybody knows who that is? He owned American Chicle. He was the founder of IBM. Okay. He also owned a big merchant house. Yeah. So Flint was his client, and so Flint offered to send weapons and munitions to Madero and give him credit. And so Gustavo Madero paid Sherborne Hopkins $50,000, which in today's money is $1 million, as a retainer. And so Sherborne Hopkins' job was to link up Flint with Madero and to promote the Madero administration in Washington, D.C., which he did. And Sommerfeld worked for Sherborne Hopkins at this juncture to help with his lobbying efforts. And so this is the first time Sommerfeld was actually involved in bringing weapons and munitions to Mexico through the Flint. Then we have, of course, Pascual Orozco and Bernardo Reyes. Reyes was also against the re-election of Diaz. Diaz sent him to Europe rather than him participating in the elections. After the Madero Revolution, Reyes came back and was, I guess, pretty miffed that he wasn't part of the government, and he went to across the border. I think he went to Tucson or somewhere in the north, and he started an uprising. The first uprising in the Madero administration, and as part of this uprising, Madero dispatched Sommerfeld, who was now in charge of the Secret Service of Mexico. He was the chief of the Mexican Secret Service. And so Sommerfeld goes to El Paso, and he checks out what Reyes is doing. He denounces him to the American authorities, went to the BI, gave them all the information they needed to arrest him, and Reyes got away. He went back into Mexico, but then was arrested by the Maderistas and was sent to Santiago de Tlatelolco prison in Mexico, where he basically was cooling his heels until the end of the Madero administration. So Reyes uprising, it wasn't much of an uprising, but it's very interesting. Sommerfeld, with a deadly accuracy, used the American government to have this guy arrested. It's a pattern that follows his trail. The next big uprising, Pascual Orozco. It started actually with the Vasquez Gomez brothers that lived here, right, at the time?
Yeah.
Okay. So Francisco and Emilio Vasquez Gomez start an uprising. I guess Francisco was unhappy. He was Secretary of Education, but he was unhappy about what the Madero administration was doing. The uprising kind of was, it wasn't much of an uprising, but there was things going on and not much that Madero was doing about it, didn't take it too seriously. And at one point he sent Orozco to quell the uprising. He sends him to Ciudad Juarez. Orozco changes colors and joins the Gomez uprising and makes the uprising his own. And this was the biggest challenge to the Madero presidency. It started in the spring of 1912. Within weeks, all of Chihuahua is under Orozco control. And it was a serious challenge to the presidency. It was not sure whether Madero will survive this. Again, Madero dispatches Sommerfeld. Sommerfeld comes to El Paso and also to San Antonio, and he collaborates with the Bureau of Investigations, with the Justice Department, to identify where he gets his money and his weapons. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., Sherburne Hopkins is lobbying the U.S. government to put an embargo on the exportation of arms from the United States, which is implemented. And the only faction that was allowed to import arms and munitions was the Madero faction, since they were the presidency, right? So that's the government of Mexico. Anybody else, it was illegal. So they shut down the border. They send Sommerfeld to work with the Bureau of Investigations. Sommerfeld hires about 250 agents along the border in the United States. And they literally patrol every merchant house, every border crossing. They even were searching people going over the international bridge. It was run by Felix Sommerfeld. And so they shut down the supplies for Orozco. And of course at the same time, you have Huerta coming up, fighting the Orozquistas, and you have Villa joining the fight. And so then he gets it from all sides, and sure enough, they actually do defeat him. But it was interesting that you said that this is the largest Secret Service operation ever run on U.S. soil by a foreign government. Think about that. That was Felix Sommerfeld's organization. I call it in my book the Sommerfeld Organization. So the American government really supported the efforts. They wanted the Madero government to succeed. And so this is what they allowed, basically a foreign Secret Service. And of course they didn't know he was also a German agent. That makes it even weirder, but they allow a Mexican Secret Service chief to literally run an operation that large all along the border. Orozco basically then goes into hiding, and Sommerfeld and his organization are hunting him mercilessly. I went through 98,000 documents of the FBI files in the National Archives. You would not believe how many articles, how many memoranda were written about, where Sommerfeld saw Orozco or one of Orozco's people and so forth. It goes on and on and on. No historian has ever really looked at that because they misspelled Sommerfeld's name so horribly that unless you really look at every page, you will not find his name sometimes. It's unbelievable how his name gets mangled. But it was always Sommerfeld. That's why I call him the wreath of the Mexican Revolution. He pops up in all these books. Katz mentions him, Meyer mentions him, all these people mention him, but nobody really figured out what he was. He was very, very powerful. And then, of course, you have Victoriano Huerta. The Orozco uprising weakens the Madero government significantly. Huerta is the one that, in the end, militarily defeats the Orozquistas. And from that point on, I believe that Huerta had lost confidence in the Madero government. That's, I think, the beginning of the end. Where Huerta thinks that they're weak and he can probably defeat him and take over power. This happens then in the Decena Tragica, February 1913. Here is Manuel Mondragon. He was war minister under Porfirio Diaz, and Felix Diaz, far related, I guess, nephew or something of Porfirio Diaz. Nephew, I think. Yeah. And actually a dilettante. He never really played a big role under Porfiriato. Later he claimed because of his name that he did, but he really was a police chief, I think, on Yucatan somewhere. So he did really nothing big to report, but when he saw that he could play a role in bringing down Madero, he plotted with Mondragon to bring down the government of Francisco Madero. The Decena Tragica starts with these guys raising some troops, and they go to the prison of Santiago Tlatelolco. They free Bernardo Reyes. One of the big mistakes of Madero was he was too nice, he let him live. So here's Reyes now taking charge of this this attack. They charged the presidential palace in the morning, and one of the first people killed is Reyes. He walked ahead of his troops and he got shot in the head. That was the end of that. And Sommerfeld, as the Secret Service chief, knew something was happening. He actually warned Madero days before that there's something afoot. He can't put his finger on it. But so they had guards posed. This is something when you read about the Decena Tragica, it's very interesting. It looks like Madero was completely inept and completely unprepared. Not so whatsoever. They had a machine gun on top of the presidential palace faster than you could count to 3. This is why Reyes was killed. It was actually Gustavo Madero who manned the first machine guns. He took charge of this before the war minister even could come out, General Villar. And in fact, within 2 days, the uprising was quelled. The attackers, Diaz, fled to the Ciudadela, and they had lots of munitions there. And it was only the treachery of Huerta that allowed them to sustain this defeat. Huerta was secretly giving them food and munitions and so forth. And so they were firing cannons in downtown Mexico City. Lots of civilians were killed. People were fleeing. It was a horrible scene. And this went on for days. One of the big conspirators in this is, of course, Henry Lane Wilson, the American ambassador. He sides, he hated Madero, and he sides with Huerta and Felix Diaz, and he brokers this deal by which he guarantees Huerta a recognition by the U.S. government if he gets rid of Madero. And he did this without support of the U.S. government, by the way. That's something that has to be said.
What did he recall?
Well, Taft was still president, right? So as the Decena Tragica unfolded, Wilson took power. It's the first thing that confronted his administration. He didn't know what the hell to think of what. I mean, he had no idea. And so yes, Wilson, when he found out what happened, he sent Henry Lane, he sent a journalist friend of his to Mexico to research it, and he reported back that Wilson acted against the wishes of the U.S. government at that point, his Taft administration. They brought him back, and they didn't fire him. They allowed him to retire. And he did, but he didn't do so easily. He wrote a bunch of books and articles and gave speeches against the Wilson administration. Big enemy of Wilson. During the uprising, Felix Sommerfeld was protecting the Madero family. He was personally in charge of protecting the Madero family. The first thing he did is he took Madero's parents and sister to the German embassy. And that's where they stayed until Madero was actually arrested. You can see here a document that I found. It says F.A. Sommerfeld, agent. This is a document, a guest list of the German embassy. It was a top secret document, and he's actually listed there as an agent. So he hid the Madero family there. The Maderos, after the second day, thought everything is okay. Madero, Francisco Madero has everything under control. They left. Big mistake. It got worse. In the end, Gustavo gets murdered, and Francisco gets arrested. And now is the question how to get him out of this miserable situation. When Madero was arrested, this is a very fascinating story, and I would like to read it out of my book. Sommerfeld played a crucial role. Remember, he's in charge of the security of the president. So let me read you about the arrest of Madero.
Okay.
What page? Can you find it?
135.
It is
250.
page 249.
Oh, that's neat.
So this is the story of his arrest. The president was not alone when the soldiers came with their guns drawn. A firefight with Madero's guards ensued. Several of the soldiers were killed. Marcos Hernandez, the justice minister's brother, who was standing next to the president, also died in a hail of bullets. Ambassador Wilson's agent, Enrique Cepeda, who was a member of the arresting party, was shot in the hand. Being promoted the governorship of Mexico City as a reward for his treachery, his bleeding hand seemed a small price to pay. Madero, uninjured because Cepeda had orders from Wilson to take him alive, slipped by the confused troops and rushed into the adjoining hall. A group of rurales that had heard the gunfire rushed to the building. Madero opened a window in the hallway and shouted to the soldiers below that everything was under control. Then he entered the elevator. When he exited on the main floor, General Blanquet met him with his pistol drawn, without any options other than slapping General Blanquet in the face, which he did. Madero gave himself up. All but 2 members of the cabinet were also arrested. The fact that when the arresting party surprised Madero, it is a fact that when the arresting party surprised Madero, the president was with Marcos Hernandez, the justice minister's brother. Madero was not, as most historical accounts claim, in a cabinet meeting. That meeting had ended, and although in the building the cabinet members were not with Madero when the soldiers came. In addition, Madero had a security detail with him. One would expect armed guards in front of the palace or protecting certain areas, but not next to the president while he conducted a cabinet meeting. Only under the scenario that Madero knew in advance that a putsch was underway would he have surrounded himself with armed guards. Given the timeline with Gustavo's arrest 1 hour before and the president having been warned, it seemed that Francisco Madero was wrapping up urgent business and prepared to flee the palace just as the soldiers entered. The president quickly ran to the elevator and tried to exit the building. It makes no sense that before Madero ran, he called out of the window and stopped the soldiers who were there to help him. The only purpose of this interlude could have been that he had an escape plan. That last piece of circumstantial evidence is that Rafael Hernandez was one of the 2 cabinet members who escaped that day. Madero's uncle Ernesto Madero was the second escapee. No one knows where the 2 ministers hid from the searching troops. A good bet is that both of them went to the house of Hernandez's law partner McLaren or the German embassy. Assuming that Hernandez and Ernesto Madero escaped around the exact time when Madero was arrested, was Madero following his cabinet officers to a car that waited at a side entrance of the palace? Was Sommerfeld the driver? I can't prove it. But I'm pretty sure that's exactly what happened. What Sommerfeld did is he drove a car, that is fact. He actually, after the arrest of Madero, immediately went to the castle, and he took Sarah Madero, and the parents of Madero to the Japanese embassy, and had to go through a bunch of roadblocks and so forth. He risked his life to save the Madero family. And I'm pretty sure that it was the same car that was supposed to pick up Francisco Madero. It makes no sense that Madero says, no, don't help me, I have everything under control. He was running, and he didn't want anybody disturbing his escape. Again, this is my personal theory. This is from what I've read about the Decena Tragica. I'm sure there are lots of historians that would argue with me, and I challenge them to find the documents. I want to know the truth. So anyway, so Sommerfeld played a very important role in this, again, as a security detail. Huerta had him on a blacklist. They looked all over Mexico City for Sommerfeld to arrest him, and he surely would have been executed. Sommerfeld hid, of course, in the German embassy. They couldn't touch him. He stayed there for 4 weeks until Admiral Hinze took him under diplomatic guard to Veracruz, and from there to Havana, and then Sommerfeld went to New York. And where did he go? He went to Sherborne G. Hopkins, who meanwhile got a nice $50,000 down payment to help the Carrancista uprising. So everything becomes the same, right? So Carranza paid Sherborne his fee, and from now on, Carranza is supported by Sherborne Hopkins. Sommerfeld again works for Hopkins. He comes down to San Antonio. He joins the Carrancistas, and he becomes their weapons supplier through Flint. Right? So not much change. Okay, so this resistance.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What was Flint's interest in all of this?
He owned huge rubber plantations, and he owned railroads. And of course, it was very important for him that his investments are secure. So he wanted to exert influence on the Mexican Revolution. That's why he supported it.
Talking of the Twin Walls.
The American chieftain, was his company, yeah.
So from what today is Cancun, they tap the resin like they tap maple syrup they tap.
Mhm.
The cheese was that white stuff that is converted into secret flavor. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had big business interests, and I think he was also the front man of a consortium of investors that had interest in Mexico. I don't think it was Flint by himself. I'm sure there were other people on Wall Street that wanted to make Madero successful. So the constitutionalist movement starts up. Carranza becomes the first chief of the constitutionalist army. Horrible violence ensues. Pancho Villa enters the fray. The beginning of the great division of the North. He starts with a few men and a few arms when he goes from El Paso into Mexico. A year later, he has the largest army in the Mexican Revolution, over 40,000 troops. One interesting thing about Pancho Villa is also that he staged some of his battles for the Mutual Film Company so that they could film it, and that was part of a propaganda campaign against who was in charge of Felix A. Sommerfeld. Felix Sommerfeld worked for Carranza briefly, didn't really like him, but he did support Hale, the Hale mission, when Wilson sent him to Mexico to find out what really happened in the Decena Tragica. So Sommerfeld arranges interviews with Carranza and Mr. Hale, but he didn't like Carranza. He thought he was very stubborn, he was unapproachable, he was unreasonable, and by the end of the year 1914, Sommerfeld joins Villa. And there were rifts between Carranza and Villa already at that time, because Villa was becoming very powerful. And so Sommerfeld basically handles his public relations, which he was in dire need of, I have to say. He supports the movie companies. He at that time lives in New York in the Hotel Astor, and he becomes Villa's main weapons supplier. So one of the first things that happened, here's a nice picture, right? Here's Felix Sommerfeld next to Pancho Villa, that's from that time. Like I said, there are very, very few pictures of Sommerfeld, but this one exists. They said he was always very dapper, very nicely, very clean shaven and everything. They called him, the Mr. Sommerfeld. He was a diplomat now, and he was the arms chief, and so he had social status. His income from Villa was about $5,000 per month. So that's about $100,000 a month, not too shabby for selling weapons. And of course, here's the first chief, Carranza. So here some things happen, right? So the revolution, the first thing that happens in April 1914 is the occupation of Veracruz. I don't know if anybody remembers that. The American government tries to stop weapons from reaching Huerta. These weapons were carried on a German ship, the Ipiranga, and so they all Ipiranga.
That's
Same
the
ship.
one used to take
Diaz.
Diaz.
Exactly. Yeah. It was a Hapag ship. The German merchant marine had lots of traffic between Mexico and Germany. Like I said, it was a big trading partner. And so the Ipiranga and the Bavaria, they carried weapons that were ordered under the Madero administration. This is something that nobody's ever written about. I don't understand. Madero concluded these contracts with Krupp Steel. The weapons were delivered. At that time, of course, the Mexican government is headed by Huerta. And the timing of the occupation of Veracruz is very interesting because Villa was on his way to occupy Veracruz. And he gets held up in Tampico. And so the timing is very interesting because Sommerfeld actually wrote that he wanted Villa to have these weapons. But it didn't come that way. The ships came while Huerta was still in charge of Veracruz. And the Americans occupied the harbor before the ship actually anchored or came to the dock to unload, which was a big mistake because it wasn't now in the hands of the Americans. So the German government, furious, their ship is held up. So they call the Americans and say, you need to release the ship. They release the ship. Hapag goes to Puerto Mexico, unloads the weapons, and Huerta happens. So the whole occupation of Veracruz was a joke. The Americans hadn't timed it right, the weapons went to Huerta anyway, and Felix Sommerfeld and Karl Heinen, who was the Habak representative, they were furious at the Americans because they wanted Villa to have these weapons. Very important in this is also that Sommerfeld starts having responsibility for diplomacy. And one of the things that he did do is Carranza, of course, told the Americans, get the hell out, we don't want Americans in Mexico and so forth. Sommerfeld convinces Villa that in order to endear himself to the American government, he should say, let them do it, it will just hurt Huerta. And this is exactly what Villa did. This was under the influence of Sommerfeld. So very interesting, the rift between Carranza and Villa becomes really significant. He was soldiers marching through Veracruz. It was a big deal. The Americans stayed there for the whole year. Okay, then there were some other things that were problematic with Villa. Here is his Rodolfo Fierro, the butcher. There were murders and executions and revenge killings, and Pancho Villa in the U.S. press, Sommerfeld wants Villa to get diplomatic recognition, right? And so, you know, you can't get diplomatic recognition if you're portrayed as a thug, so he tries everything to make Villa look good. He promotes his movies, the great hero of freedom and liberty in Mexico, and Fierro was a real problem. This is William S. Benton. Anybody ever heard of William S. Benton? He was a Scottish immigrant, owned a ranch in Chihuahua, and he went to Villa to complain about, I guess they were stealing his cattle, and he got really mad about it. He complained to Villa. He never left the house alive. Nobody knows exactly what happened. An altercation with Villa obviously ensued. Whether Fierro shot him or Villa shot him, whatever happened, they dumped him somewhere in the countryside. His body was never found. But Sommerfeld, interestingly enough, Sommerfeld was a friend of William Benton. And this drawing is a wanted poster that Sommerfeld drew. See here, F.A. Sommerfeld? Sommerfeld drew this wanted poster. He was trying to find Benton. They did a big investigation. Benton was never found. They probably dismembered him and threw down some canyon or something. But of course, a public relations disaster. The British government is now involved. The American government is involved. The press is full of, you know, people getting murdered right in Villa's headquarters. So, you know, Sommerfeld had his hands full to make Villa look good on the American side. Here's another interesting connection that happened at that time. Franklin Olin. Anybody ever heard of Olin Industries? Big defense contractor still today. Franklin Olin was a manufacturer of arms, munitions, in Alton, Illinois, the Western Cartridge Company. And so Sommerfeld knew him quite well because he was importing dynamite to Chihuahua for Villa, and so, you know, this dynamite actually came from Olin. And so Sommerfeld convinced Franklin Olin to start producing 7